When we last left our heroes, we were talking about a very abbreviated history of museums, looking at the very beginnings of collections being the hoard of materials that conquerors and rulers had amassed, and then needing a place to store. And then with the need to inventory and then care for them emerged the role of a curator, who in the very early stages would have been, in essence, just a record keeper. And then by the 19th and 20th century, the need to expand the role of the collection as well as the museum so that they become publicly accessible. However, even the level of access that you would have had in a museum in many ways would have been dependent upon your educational standing. So if you were at the Field Museum in Chicago, you could get into the collections in the back if you were a scholar, but most common people could not get back there. So you had to go through, and it still is that way today. You have to go through a series of permissions in order to access the inner sanctums of many of the museums. So the roles actually have revised somewhat in museums, particularly the 20th and 21st centuries, which we are in now. This coming as a result of world wars as well as socio-cultural revolutions. What I watched with wonder, for example, was during the conflicts, plural, with Iraq, and the museum in Baghdad being bombed, as well as the looting that occurred there of some amazing antiquities, that the museum was looted, and these antiquities being part of an underground antiquity market that is doing very well in dealing with lost antiquities and treasures. But there was a lot of furor over the bombing of the museum because it was one of the holding places of some of the most important antiquities of humankind. That they have been in some ways focal points for nationalist propaganda, a way that a country can feel good about itself by giving a select view of history. All right, very rarely will you see a national museum that portrays its downside. All right, the injustices that country has wreaked havoc upon the world. That will usually be all the wonderful things we do. That's part of propaganda, telling part of the story. To create institutional as well as familial contexts. This being particular from the 1980s on, where museum professionals needing to expand the kind of people who are coming to museums and making it a place where families want to go, making museums as attractive as many of the national monuments. The roles have changed as a result of economic changes around the globe, the need for public education, and as I mentioned earlier, edutainment, and edutainment being some of these huge, these blockbuster exhibits. They get an amazing amount of hype and an amazing amount of public relations and incredibly high attendance. This is part of that notion that you can have fun as you learn in a museum, and it can be family fun. But museums have also become corporate platforms, that there are many corporations who, as a way of, you might say, alleviating some of a tax burden from being a corporation by giving money to museums and other types of institutions. So they get a tax break in doing so. However, they also get to have their name associated with a culturally relevant, culturally important museum. So it becomes credibility by association. And you even see this with corporate broadcasting. All right, this program brought to you by Reynolds Aluminum or some other corporate sponsor. All right, that it's a way of having their name associated with something that has a feel-good feeling about it, and yet at the very base they are a capitalist venture, and it is a way to make their name known in advertising, and not spending that money on advertising, but actually using it as a tax write-off too. So these roles in museums are still changing. And within this context then, so are the roles of curators. So we're going to set a context then, because we've kind of established just a very, 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 very quick history of museums. And I will put another reading up on the website that talks more in detail about the history of museums too, still in a very abbreviated manner. And then as we are curating then in a museum setting, what is this context, this environment, this mindset that we are approaching as a professional? But this includes not just museums. This includes cultural centers. Now, one of the differences between a cultural center and a museum, cultural centers tend to be more contemporary. They also tend to be more geared toward maintaining culture. They have a higher level of public access to collections and objects because they are done with the intent to maintain. And so they are seen as an important and even in some instances a vibrant part of a community. And you also have more, you might say, people who wouldn't be considered professionals by degree, but would be credible by their experience. So you tend to see a lot more of not only the hands-on type of things being done, you would also be getting a lot more information and programming from people in the community who may not even have a bachelor's degree, may not even have been past 6th grade, but have a knowledge of herbology on par with Tom, Antonio, may have a knowledge of flora and fauna in a given region, plants and animals in a given region, than any of your natural scientists and your zoologists. But they've gotten it through real life experience rather than a university setting. Now, within many museums then, you have interdependent. And interdependent means that these departments rely upon each other and that you are going to have administration. You cannot really have any type of entity function without administration. People have to be conscious of the day-to-day activities, and that includes particularly the fiscal responsibilities or financial responsibilities. You also have operations who fall under the, you might say, the command of operations, and then curation, as well as other types of departments. So, and curation, in essence, is is care for the objects that the administration is securing funding to maintain, and operations is spending money to preserve. Another important dynamic and difference that we see, for example, with cultural centers and museums, is that many museums, the intent is to preserve the physical integrity of an object for as long as you can. You want to make sure that it does not deteriorate. And objects deteriorate through our handling because all of us are greasy, for example. Right? We all have oil in our hands. You could just wash your hands with the most intense soap, you still have oil in your hands. If you didn't, your skin would be dry as papyrus. And you can go and pick something up, a metal object, handle it a little bit, walk away, come back a week later, you'll still see your fingerprints. That's why in many museums, when people are handling objects, what do they have to wear? Gloves. Different kinds of gloves, depending on what it is you're handling. So that's because we are greasy people. Thank God. But that oil in our skin can actually cause some objects to deteriorate, particularly something made of paper, for example, or it can oxidize on metal. It can end up being a permanent part of that object. Now, this is where we talk about a little bit of transformation of perception, though, because when something has been handled a lot, you can just change the name a little bit and you say that it now has a patina. A patina is the surface that something acquires from constant handling. Or you'll even hear something, because one of the ways that I worked in a gallery, when we had a lot of religious art there. And there were a lot of small crucifixes that people had where it originally had Christ on the cross, but it had been used for rosary so many times that Christ no longer had a nose or a face. It had been worn smooth. And what used to be like a where he was wrapped in that kind of tunic. It turned into a dress. It had been rubbed so smooth. And what we said was, you can see the adoration in this object, rather than the wear and tear from somebody rubbing it from all the sins they did. It's a transformation. It's perception by the labels that we use. In cultural centers, you will often have more direct access to objects because they may even be used ceremonial, such as masks, such as capes, all right, such as mantas or kilts, even sometimes moccasins may be used regularly. So people store them in the culture center, and then when they're time to be danced, they're brought out. You cannot walk into NMAI and say, I want to use that Seahawk. It's a museum. And their intent is to maintain the physical integrity. In a cultural center, that may not be the case, because objects actually have a natural life. It's expected. They're going to wear out, and then you put another one in there. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that it's not from 1890 and it was made by Charles Eden Shaw, or made in 1910 by Willie Seaweed, or in 1980 by Bill Reed. It doesn't matter. Objects have a lifespan. It's different in a museum. If anything, in a museum, you're almost like a necromancer. You're trying to keep things alive beyond, keep it alive beyond its actual lifespan. So within administration, that you will have people who will watch over personnel. They are the people who, in essence, are responsible for getting out job listings, hiring, sometimes firing, human relations or human resources, insurance policies, and the like, your benefits. You also have accounting, business, handle not only acquisitions and buying, but any finance that's spent in upkeep. So that's your financial responsibility. General services. You may have people who are specifically dedicated to fundraising, and you may have people who are specifically dedicated to PR, public relations, media generation. Now, there aren't that many culture centers that can afford this level of administration. And probably in your own tribe's cultural center, you may actually be working as the curator, the director of education, as well as the conservator, as well as the PR person, especially in a time when financial money being set aside for various cultural institutions has shrunk drastically. So this is just a summary of some of what occurs in administration. In operations, you'll often find out this is where the conservation lab will be. And once again, conservation to maintain the physical integrity of objects. You have people who are involved in exhibits, in public education, tech services, which include, it could include exhibit installation, but it could include things like your information technology, your computers, could be your phone systems. Then you have facility management and security.